It's the first time I've read it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. This is one of those particularly exciting nights where not only are we gathered here to celebrate a debut collection, although of course by the quality of the present here, you would never have guessed that, we are also here to celebrate a relatively recent addition to the Winnipeg writing community, so it is a particularly celebratory evening all around. We are here, of course, to celebrate the launch of What Fills Your House Like Smoke, the debut collection of poetry from McGregor. To Thistledown Press for, of course, first of all, publishing the book, and also for helping to make this evening a possibility. In the pages of this collection, McGregor combines the lore of family history with personal memory, vividly parsing patterns of inheritance, particularly through the maternal line. In the words of Hole Gallery, What Fills Your House Like Smoke is a staggering collection, technically agile and thematically nuanced. McGregor's poems have the effect of a flame, sucking the air out of a room, of a soothing hand on your chest, reminding you to breathe, an indelible debut. I very unwisely put together my introduction with a staple, which is my this. But we are very privileged to have another astonishing poet here to chat with McGregor following her reading, and that, of course, is Jennifer Still. Following the reading and the conversation, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you're located here, please feel free to raise your hand. I'll come up to you with a microphone, which is not because I don't believe you can project your voice. It just ensures that those watching at home can actually hear the question. If you are one of those folks watching at home, feel free to write any questions or supportive comments you might have in the chat, and we'll be sure to pass them along. I'll be back at the close of the evening to go over signing procedure, so look forward to that exciting announcement. But for now, I have the immense pleasure of welcoming tonight's participants. Your host, Jennifer Still, composes poems with physicality in the Red River Valley, Treaty 1 territory, the heart of the Métis Nation. She is the author of 3 poetry books, Comma, Girlwood, and Saltations, and several handmade chapbooks, including her most recent, Legs, a limited edition with Baseline Press. She recently collaborated with Winnipeg artist Christine Fellows and Chantal Moreau to adapt her long poem Legs into an award-winning film poem and gallery installation. And I've just learned that Legs will be broadcast as part of a screening at the Winnipeg Art Gallery on June 8th, so please do check it out if you have an opportunity. Our featured guest, McGregor, is a Euro-settler Métis writer currently living in Winnipeg. Her poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction have appeared in numerous magazines, including Room, the Dalhousie Review, CV2, The Fiddlehead, and others. She obtained a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of British Columbia in 2022. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. The wizard behind the curtain. So I understand I'm to do some readings here. So I will get through that and hopefully not bore everybody to death. I'm trying not to read in monotone because I've been told don't read in monotone. No promises. So I'm going to start with the prologue to the book itself, which is called Instructions for the Death of a Grandmother. Drag your hangover to the hospital and sit with your grandmother while she is dying. Listen to her death rattle and count the lengthening seconds of apnea the way one might count the minutes between birth contractions. Be amazed at how long a body can go without taking a breath. Comfort your mother who is pretending not to smell the stale alcohol on your skin. Wonder if your grandmother can smell it. Wonder if it is comforting or repelling to her. Keep your fingers busy by alternating between holding your grandmother's hand and knitting a fuzzy purple scarf for no one. Take a break and go to the cafeteria to eat Jell-O with a dollop of fake whipped cream because that's what your grandmother would have bought you. Later, go again and eat a surprisingly good barbecue chicken dinner. Absorb the hours and hours. Keep counting the moments between the gurgle-thick breaths. Drink can after can of soda pop. Keep thinking the end is imminent. Hope for the end and feel ashamed. Absorb more hours. Watch the light leave the window. Watch the darkness soak into the window like a stain. Feel jittery and hollow as the night deepens. Hear the quiet creeping through the ward. Give in to the nurse's suggestions and take your mother to the family room down the hall. Lie down with your mother on top of the polyester bed cover and close your eyes. Start awake to a nurse's urgent whisper and hurry back to your grandmother's room. Reach for your grandmother's hand, but note its cool, claw-like texture. Slide your hand under your grandmother's blanket and lay it on her naked stomach. Be reminded of rising bread dough. Feel relieved it is still warm, almost alive. Keep your hand there for a while. Resist the urge to fold onto your grandmother's body. Be comforted by your mother. Try to comfort your mother. Attempt to close your grandmother's eyes and find it not at all like the movies. After several attempts, manage to get them mostly closed so that your grandmother looks like she is pretending to sleep, but is watching you through the fringe of her eyelashes. Try to close your grandmother's mouth, but give up when her jaw resists and your efforts tilt her whole head back. Say goodbye. Let your feet leave the hospital. Drive with your mother to your parents' house in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. Stop at a 24-hour gas station and let your mother buy you a Twix bar. While you wait in the car, notice the way the gas bar lights make everything look silver. Notice the song that is playing on the radio and file it away in your memory as a signifier of this moment. Years later, forget what song it was and feel bereft. Years later, experience moments when your synapses misfire, causing you to forget, just for an instant, that any of this happened at all. The next poem I'm gonna read is the second poem in the book, called How Do I Write You? I wasn't actually gonna read this poem, but Jen suggested, I think it was Jen, who had a comment about how it sort of sets up the book. How do I write you? I write you blurred, ephemeral, the way you show up in dreams without translation from my lesion to yours. I write you on a platform, leaving with your children who are only eyes barely over the window ledge. I write you with the perpetual loop of your cadence, your reed in my head, the sound of your laugh, deep throat bass blossoming from your lungs. I write you here in this room I've made mine and yours, your aprons hanging from the bookshelf, a photograph of your mother scowling, or maybe contemplating, all these lives tumbled out of her legs, the shape and seeping, river flowing, pooling, flowing, it pools here, around us, these small words. So the next three poems are like a triptych. It's, there's sort of three poems that are connected. I think that's right, triptych, is that right? First one, flight. Flurry, thick spring snow, my grandmother packs her children in layers, forces their feet into boots stuffed with newspaper. They wrap the youngest in blankets, place her, like an egg, on a sled used to haul wood. Everyone's pockets bulge, wax paper packets, bannock and jerky. My grandmother lingers a last look in the mirror by the door, strokes the fur collar on her shoulders, a gift she ought not have accepted. Where are we going? Cry the children. The door opens, the wild, wet world blows in. She carves the snow. The older children trudge behind. She jerks the rope of the sled. The egg wobbles. Journey. They take turns pulling the youngest child in the sled. At night, they unroll a stained oilskin tarpaulin, sleep dreamless and hungry. The air begins to warm, the snow is sticky, then wet. By the time they reach the banks of the North Saskatchewan, the sled drags on mud and rock. The river is high and swift. They stop. "Give me your clothes," the mother says. The two older children slip behind a thin screen of dogwood. The youngest wriggles free on the naked bank, pushes pink toes into mud. The mother gathers up all the clothes, heavy and ripe with days of walking. She ties each garment to an old cottonwood until the tree looks full of other people's prayers. "What do we wear now?" ask the children. The youngest watches them, places a handful of mud inside her mouth. Metamorphosis. Spongy with matted grass pierced by saplings, the bank is steep. Heat from the midday sun releases a cloud of musk, sedge, vetch, sticky yellow poplar. She rips up handfuls of old foxtail and cattail, twists green willow branches until they yield. She sits on a rock by the river and begins to weave. Weaves all day and into the evening, new skins for her naked children. At last, when the wet chill of spring dusk clings to her aching fingers, makes the children shiver and cry, she finishes. "Put these on," she says. They put on the things their mother made for them, step out of the thin bushes and into the dimming light. "Good enough," she says. Then she slips from her own skin and steps gingerly into the black river. She stands in the frigid water, night glinting around her ankles. She stands in the water. The children grow weary of watching their mother. The children, warmed by their new clothes, grow sleepy. They fall asleep to the sound of the river and the sound of the river glinting around their mother's ankles. Is it all right? A photograph of my grandmother, August 1972. She is sitting in someone's kitchen, the table cluttered with stubby brown bottles, glasses half full, almost empty pastel packs of cigarettes, an ashtray. Behind her, a window beckons, the green, long afternoon. The table is cluttered like the beach at English Bay, low tide. She is center frame, the room assembled around her, noisy, active, faces turned to the camera, a recent joke lingering. She looks down, taps the ash from her cigarette. The orb of the flash in the window glass hovers like a moon over her head. She is tapping the ash from her cigarette, a delicate suspension, just before the salty tide of us, her children, her children's children, the wave swells, lifts, and sucks her back. I remember almost nothing, only the furious fogged, oversized glasses of Mrs. M, who pinned me at recess against the school's brick wall to deliver the shame I deserved for my filthy mouth, my filth in front of everyone, the shame. Only the refuge in pink plastic ponies, the smooth mysteries of other girls' pink carpeted bedrooms, their pink arms and cheeks, the pink smoothness I could only imitate feebly until my grimy angles revealed, they fled to cleaner pastures, ponytails swishing. No wonder I insisted on learning the language of boys, scraping my knees, climbing every tree, breaking my nose twice in the schoolyard for the closeness of boys. Chubby T with the perpetual sinus infection, who invited me to swim in his pool. Red-headed R, whose mother died and who cried when I fell from the tire swing in his yard. Brown M with a stutter, who laughed until he peed and taught me the dirtiest jokes, shameless, shameless. All right, this is the one I promised you, the man with 1.5 testicles. Man with 1.5 testicles. My cat is jealous of my long hair, keeps trying to eat it. Remember the man with 1.5 testicles, she asks, gnawing on a braid. Yes, I say, but you don't. Your grandmother's teats weren't even full yet. Stop trying to distract me. Tell me the story anyway, she says. I unhook her claws from my throat. The man with 1.5 testicles started out as a boy with 2 testicles. The boy with 2 testicles fell straight down a flight of stairs, landed on a foosball table, lost an even 1/4 of his perceived manhood. The boy with 1.5 testicles got caught smoking behind the grocery store, played doctor and lost in 5th grade, and grew into the man with 1.5 testicles, acquired a fondness for muted caftans and thick sweaters, smoked loose tobacco, drank cheap sake, played doctor with errant teenagers, and won. Associated with Cuban conspiracy theorists, fed neighborhood cats sardines from his basement apartment window, died from a massive stroke at 63. No, says the cat, licking my temple, not like that. The man with 1.5 testicles deftly rolls a joint with nicotine-stained fingers, passes it to the 16-year-old in a park where the grass is cut and sweating. The grass is cut and sweating, itching the backs of the 16-year-old's thighs, leaving crisscross marks, making her skin nervous like ants are marching, burrowing into the milk fat that will never fully grow to muscle. The man with 1.5 testicles hands the fat cocoon of the lit joint to the 16-year-old with ants burrowing into her thighs. She opens wide, swallows it whole. I'm gonna finish off with something that's a little more upbeat. My grandmother's lovers. These are the ones I know about. 2 Harrys and a Walter, the widower in the senior's home, the Jewish boy by the river. Walter's real name was something else. He had been places, was a businessman, had a magical money, a son from a previous marriage, a record. He gave her 2 babies and not a penny more. Harry number 1 was a soldier with a wife and a son, stationed at the bridge during the flood of 1950. She brought him sandwiches. He gave her a fur collar, a 3rd baby, 2 divorces. Harry number 2 was her AA sponsor, ran away with her to the shoe swap, Spain, Portugal, pawned everything she owned. He gave her a plastic hospital bracelet with her name and birth date on it. The widower in the senior's home was a glisten on her lips, then a scowl. She avoided the games room. He gave her a locked door. The Jewish boy by the river still softened her 6 decades later. He was a secret she turned over and over like a pebble in her mouth. She gave him the sweetest smile I ever saw her give.
Oh, absolutely. It's all the opera.
Okay.
What a beautiful reading. Thank you, thank you. My gosh, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Look at this, we got sun, we have a carnival, and we have poetry.
We have
Poetry on the
carnival.
inside, there's always carnivals on the outside.
I'm going to the carnival after.
Really? On the Ferris wheel? Oh. Well, it sounds like an adventurous thing that your grandmother might have done.
Yeah, she probably would have if there was beer.
Anyway, thanks everyone for coming and congratulations on
Thank
your
you.
debut book of poetry. Thank you, Thistledown, for inviting me to have this conversation with Erin, who is a poet newish to Winnipeg, and very excited to meet you. And we had tea a couple weeks ago and we got to talk about her book, and I've read it several times, and it was marvelous to hear you reading it tonight.
Thank you.
In your voice, and it wasn't monotone. And there's nothing small about your words, by the way. So thank you. So yeah, I have a whole bunch of questions prepared because it's so the best thing in the world to talk about poetry for me. And we're not going to get to them all. And then hopefully it might stir some questions in you so you can join us at some point if you'd like. What might I say? Where will I start? You've written this work with such courage and intimacy and frankness and humor. Your grandmother, I will also say straight up, when Erin and I first met, I said, is it okay for me to assume the narrator I could be the personal you? and we've agreed that that's cool to talk like. It is your grandmother. So your grandma's at the center of the collection. She's in many ways her life has been a bit reimagined by you, some of the story. Those beautiful poems you just read about the journey of her leaving with her children and going far. When I heard you reading them tonight, I was thinking of the little one as an egg, tucked in as an egg, and then the grandmother weaving a new skin for them, getting rid of the old skin, hanging them in the trees like prayers, weaving a new skin, and then the grandmother standing there in the river, being kind of washed anew herself. Anyway, it's so beautiful. It's such a huge journey, and it says so much. But I guess I wanted to ask you about the imagining of this, and how that has, I guess, I don't know, have you learned anything about your grandmother through imagining? And how has poetry helped you imagine in such a free and it feels like tender and beautiful and honorable way?
I don't know that I learned anything about her. I mean, I knew her very well. I mean, I was 21 when she passed away. And she used to be one of my primary caregivers all through my childhood, especially when I was very young, before I was like preschool age, and my parents were working, my sister was in school, so she was my primary caregiver. But she was very secretive about her life, and she also stretched things a little, told stories that were not necessarily true. So, if from wherever she is, if she's pissed off at me for this collection, well, she started it. So she wasn't always particularly honest about things. So I don't think I learned anything, but it was definitely, I mean, I've wanted for many years, like for 20 years, I've wanted to write a book about her just because she lived this extraordinary life. She grew up a Métis woman from St. Boniface here in Winnipeg, quite poor. She was the second youngest of 14 kids. She came from a very rough family, in a kind of rough community. And she had an interracial marriage. Her first marriage was to a Chinese man here in Winnipeg in 1939 or 40, I believe. And had 2 kids with him before, and then when they were separated, but when he passed away, essentially drank himself to death, she left. And there's actually a newspaper ad that I found in the Winnipeg Free Press from 1946 saying, if anyone knows the whereabouts of Dora Lee Ducharme, please contact this P.O. box number. she was MIA with the kids. And I don't know who was looking for her, but and she went to Brandon, where she met my grandfather, who was married, and then he ran away with her, left his wife and my uncle, who I'm also very close with. So she just lived this extraordinary life, and then eventually they moved to, when my mom was, I think, 5 or 6, they moved to Edmonton, and which is, that part of the country is where my sister and I were born and raised. And but at some point, just before my sister was born, my grandparents got divorced, and then she ran away with her AA sponsor, who was kind of like a gigolo. I grew up with the story that my grandma went away with a gigolo, and it was just like all this stuff happened, and yet when I was growing up, she was this sedate, warm. She was my favorite person. She was one of my favorite people in the world. She was this warm, loving, kind, sweet. She spoiled me rotten. I was her little Christmas pudding. And so there was always this incongruous nature of her history that I was told by my auntie and my mom compared to the grandmother that I knew, and she never bridged that gap. So it was up to me to sort of imagine everything in between, and she left nothing. Like when she died, there was no papers, there was a handful of old photographs, but no real record of where she had been, what she had done, any of that stuff. So.
Which is exactly what you wrote into.
Yeah, and so it was like, well, if you didn't leave me anything, I'm gonna make it up.
Yeah, like she left you space.
She left us space, yeah.
She left you imagination. And you, well, that is just a lovely tie into the next question, which is kind of about yes, there's so much natural lineage that you're following in this book, but not in a linear way. So this idea that you come back to of the kind of the circularity of relationships. Yeah, you say you refer to your mother's mother a lot. So there's instantly this like one inside the other kind of feel, right? When your grandmother's dying, we all heard you read about the counting the the death apnea, which is counting the time between breaths, and then the idea of the contractions, birth contractions, so drawing that parallel between life and death, and this really intense moment. In your final poem, which is a bookend to the book, to that initial scene in the hospital, in bodies, you write, 3 bodies, reluctant nodes of the same organism, waiting as one, which is just such a beautiful whole counter to individualism image, right? And it just transcends those relationships into this greater entity for me. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about like this shared cellular inheritance, if that's of interest to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, no matter how hard we try to not become our parents, we become our parents, right? And I have my mom had a complicated relationship with her mom, and and in some ways I have somewhat, everybody has a complicated relationship with their parents. And the things that drive me crazy about my mom, I find myself doing all the time. And the things that drove my mom crazy about her mom, she does all the time. And it's just, I think there's sort of this reconciliation of, we are who we are who we come from. And, instead of fighting that and resisting it and trying to be something different, it made more sense to me to try to look closer at it and say, well, what is that? And who are these people? And why are they the way they are? And, we inherit our parents, we inherit our grandparents. And there's a poem in the book, a couple of poems in the book about intergenerational transmission, epigenetic stress receptors, and intergenerational trauma. I don't like that term, but and that is part of our makeup. And instead of rejecting it, we may as well just sort of lean into that and say, okay, well, you want to lean into trauma, but you can lean into this is the story of my people, and this is the story of my family, and this is and find a way to be compassionate about it and accept those parts and find the good pieces in it. There were a lot of good things about my grandmother. Was an amazing grandmother to me. She wasn't such a great mom to my mom and my auntie and my uncle, but she was an amazing grandmother. And so like getting past the bad stuff and then accepting the good stuff is, part of that whole, part of like also accepting yourself, I guess.
Right. I was just going to ask you if you learned anything about yourself in the process, but like it seems like a very generous and also honest way to live and to create from. Yeah, and very generative for you creatively. Well, maybe we'll talk about poetry and remembering a little bit, because you do a lot of remembering in this work. I mean, I really relate to it. My first book, we never talked about this, but was also by Thistledown And it's also about my grandmother.
Oh, no, why can we talk about that? We'll talk about it later. Yeah.
But so I really feel an affinity to what you've done here. So in part, just a few things you've remembered in your book. You remember your childhood.
Mhm.
You remember your grandmother's soft hands. You remember the bannock squares that she pricks with a fork. You even, I think it was in the first poem, you touch the physical origin of maybe where you come from, where your mother comes from, your grandmother's abdomen, and you think of dough. You also write of forgetting that radio song that was playing that you said was the signifier of this moment. So if you don't remember, has it happened?
Mhm.
So you put a lot of emphasis on remembering as reality, right? Or as proof or something. I don't know.
Yeah, or also just the ephemeral nature of memory, right?
Mm.
Like there are things that I remember, and then I talk to my sister about them, and she's like, that didn't happen to me, that happened to you, or that didn't happen to you, that happened to me, or that didn't happen. You know, like memory is, and I think our imagination will often interfere, right, with memory. And, you know, lots of people have written about that. And because memory is inherently unreliable, I think, you know, sort of teasing that out a little bit, there are things, you know, that we all remember, like tangible things from childhood that are almost like elemental or visceral memories, right? Like smells will trigger it, or sound, or color, or something, and we'll be taken back to like a totally inconsequential moment, like playing with a particular toy in a closet on a nothing Saturday or whatever it is, right? And I think those memories are true, but it's when we try to piece things together into a story, it's like, well, is that story really true? Is that, you know, is that actually memory, or is that just our synapses misfiring, or trying to make sense of random things? So, and I found, you know, and poetry is a very fun and easy and safe place to explore all of that,
Right.
because we're not really, I mean, we're telling a story, but we're not really telling a story. It can also be telling around a story, right? In a way that in fiction or nonfiction is harder to do.
Right.
So you can really sort of, you can get away with a lot in poetry.
And yet you're telling around is still very focused, you know? I find, did you find in writing, as you were writing, the memories surprised you, or?
No, they're things that I've always carried with me, and I you know, they're touchstones. They're most of the memories in this book are things that I have for all my whole life, like just come back to and come back to and come back to. Like there's sort of those indelible gouges in our brain material, right? Like this thing isn't going anywhere, and so like put it out there, but can't get it out.
No, it's in more than one place.
Yeah.
You mentioned the kind of like the early imprinted elemental memory, and when I first read your book, your use and descriptions of sound really floored me. It's like creating this interiority by hearing sounds and things that you might not normally associate with sound. I'll share a few with you. They're private sounds from the insides of things. It's like amplifying the unspoken. And they are the sound of the river glinting around a grandmother's ankles. The sounds from a mother's lungs. The whisper of a nurse's sleeve removing tubes and needles. And a moth against a window. These are just a few, but they're very delicate sounds that are very interior. And there's a lot of mention of shame and revealing maybe of secrets. And I guess I want to ask you, how are sounds important to you, or how are they connected to memory? And we'll start with that.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, I think all of the senses, like sight, sound, smell, touch, you know, how we use our body in this world, and we, especially as children, when we're experiencing the world, and there's still newness to the world. I mean, I think there's still newness as an adult too, but when you're a child, it's all the time. And so I think sound is sometimes as triggering for memory or as tied to memory as, like everyone says smell is that, you know, that really strong memory trigger. Like you smell something and it just immediately transports you back to a memory. And that is true. But for me, sound is almost equally that. Music in particular, like if I listen to a song that I listened to when I was 15, I'm immediately 15 again. I know I'm in a kitchen, you know, washing dishes with the sunlight streaming through a window, listening to Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms or something, right?
Do you dance? Are you dancing?
You know, well, no, not when I, maybe not, depends on the memory, but like, and then, but also too, like just small sounds. So, and with, it's funny because with respect to, actually both my grandmothers, but with this grandmother in this book, when she was older, she lived in this apartment building in Edmonton, and it had like climate control, I want to say. So like there was, you know, AC and whatever, and the closest, every time I'm in a quiet office building, so when I'm in my office building where I work and there's not that many people there and it's not a lot of noise going on, so if I'm in early or late, it has that same sort of humming sound, and it immediately transports me back to my grandmother's apartment because it had the same sound. Just the sound of hands on fabric sometimes, depending on the nature of that, is very evocative. Yeah, so I just think, and I'm assuming I'm not alone in that, but to me it's the same as smell, or, you know, sight less so, but smell and sound very much triggering for memories.
It's almost like a music of the ordinary world or something.
Yeah, and I do think too, you know, the sound of water in particular is very specific. Like it has so many different nuances and iterations, and I think even more so than other types of sounds, water, the sound of water, and especially water in a stream or water in a river or a lake or something like that, has a certain quality that is also a very specific mood or memory or whatever. So.
And there's a lot of water in your book. You know, there's the river, which was in the poem you read, felt like a healing place, but it was also your grandmother witnessed a drowning of a friend, so a really traumatic place. There's a scene where your grandmother's making lunch, and you say she moves as if she's underwater. So it feels like even when you're not near water, the water is informing the work. It's really beautiful. There's so much. Oh yes, and your book is titled "What Fills Your House Like Smoke." So there's a lot of water, but there's something else going on. There's smoke. There's a poem. Would you mind reading that first? Age 12, the countdown. Sure. There's a poem called "Learning to Count," and it goes back in age from, I believe, age 12 all the way down to 1. And it's phenomenal, and I would love if you read the first stanza.
Sure, do you know what page it's on?
And also, it holds the title of your collection, so that's why I felt it was important. I marked it because I knew.
Oh, here it is, 71. Still astonishes me that I had 71 pages of poetry to put in here. All right, 12. You are admitted into the realm of adult knowledge. It feels violent and unwanted. You resent your mother for giving it to you, but once the gate is opened, she gives it all. An initiation, as if you're ready. Words that give shape to the shame that fills your house like smoke. Before you had the words, the smoke was just the air. Now you know something is burning.
Thank you. I encourage everyone to continue reading that poem. And my question to you is, what is burning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, so as I mentioned, my grandmother I adored her, and she adored me, and she was one of my favorite people on the whole planet, and she was nothing but softness and sweetness and joy, and I think she only got mad at me once, and she spanked me actually, but that's because I shoved a stick down my sister's throat when she was playing dead, so I probably deserved it.
Should we have saved her money?
No, it was after my sister ran into the house screaming and crying. Anyway, my grandma did see it from the window. So when I was 12, my mother revealed to me rather unceremoniously that my grandmother had been a raging alcoholic for my mother's entire childhood and my auntie and uncle's childhood, and it devastated me. I idolized my grandmother. She was the perfect human, and then suddenly to find out that, I mean, it's one thing to be an alcoholic, but she was not a nice alcoholic. She had I'll just leave it at that. She was not a nice alcoholic. And there was a lot of, and then there was other things, which the book touches on, and people can pull that from the book, but there were other things that were revealed as well that were very unsettling and very disturbing and very shameful about our family. And it just, like, as a middle-aged adult looking back, I can see the patterns that our family had and the way we interacted with the world and each other, and how private we were, and you don't talk about anything outside of the house, and even in the house there's certain things you generally don't talk about, and so the smoke being the air, that was just what I was raised in, that's just the atmosphere. But then having it named was something else, having it named as this specific history, which was rather unpleasant, totally, changed how I saw myself, how I saw the world, how I saw my grandmother. It took me years to love my grandmother the way that I used to love her again. From 12 until about 17, I didn't love her the way that I had loved her growing up. And then it wasn't until I was 17, 18, when I sort of came back to her and was like, well, that was when she was a mother, and now she's a grandmother and she's a different person. So that wasn't my experience of her, and I was able to be very close with her still near the end.
It says so much how her story affected your life,
Yeah.
or her understanding of her story cast a new meaning or new identity on you. And I relate. I have alcoholism in my family. It was a huge shock, and I can't believe how much it became about me. And in some ways, like, not saying that's about you, but figuring out how this all fit in the story. This isn't my story. In Metamorphosis, you touch on, well, you don't make a connection between alcoholism, but you do say that you read this poem, everything is underwater because she holds it down. And maybe I was thinking a bit about alcoholism, but I think you've answered my question. I guess maybe what I want to ask is, can poetry release what is long held down?
Yes and no. In some ways, maybe. In other ways, no. I mean, my immediate family are not, they're not aware of this book. Don't tell my mom. It's not because I'm ashamed of it or anything, or because I'm ashamed of my family or anything. It's just, my parents are elderly. They don't need to, there's stuff in here they don't need to know, or revisit. So in some ways I do think so. And I think, as each generation, if we become more aware of the patterns we inherit, if we look at them head on and we say, I don't want my family to look like that. I don't want my life to look like that. I don't want to embody those patterns. You don't always succeed, but we progress. And in that way, for me, writing this book not only allowed me to sort of understand my family inheritance and my grandmother in a different way. I didn't learn things about my grandmother, but I learned things about myself and my relationship to her, and but also my mother, right? And so in some ways, I do think that when you're writing a collection of poems that is very focused on a particular theme or themes, especially if they're personal. I mean, this is, my sister knows about the book, and she said to me, oh my God, you can do whatever you want now because you've essentially just blown your wad on the book, right? Like, anything personal is in here, and so now you can, like, you know, write experimental stuff. And have fun. But yeah, I do think it's, I don't want to say it's cathartic, but it is. You know, that's such a cliche, but it's true. And it's not even just in poetry, although poetry allows you to come at difficult subject matter from the side, from below, from above, to circle around it, to play with it, to make shit up. You know, like you can, it allows you the space to dig in without having to structure it in any sort of truth-telling way, which is, I think, helpful and important.
And not to be linear.
And not to be linear. Yeah.
Follow too rigid. Yet you structured the work with around the idea of lines. So it's dotted lines, blurred lines, and hard lines are the three sections of the work. And I was thinking today about how you really were or are drawing, like you're really defining over and over again. Like I think of a dotted line and I think of a pattern, you know, for like around clothing pattern, and the blurred lines and the smoke, the hard lines. I really appreciate what you're sharing here this evening, and it's to add to what you said about it maybe being a bit cathartic. As a reader, I feel so much love in the work, not a exposure, but a protecting with dignity. You know, it's pretty remarkable. I feel like you have found a really beautiful balance of sharing and also not just like,
not getting all Jerry Springer.
Maybe that's the word. I didn't know what to say. But like, it doesn't have to just be the dark, right? Like it's just such a lovely balance that you've given it.
Oh, I'm glad it reads that way, because I mean, it is a work of love. I still very deeply love my grandmother, and you know, despite knowing what I know about things, and but yeah, I mean, and I love my mother, I love my grandmother, I love my sister. Like, it is a work of love. So
and to pay attention, right? Pay attention and say, okay, like to look at something with open eyes is brave and real, and love. What else might we talk about? Is there anything else you want to talk about?
Not in particular.
I kind of jumped around. Well, I did have one other question. Well, let's go with it. You're talking about like everything doesn't have to be dark, but you do have a poem called The Weeds. And since it's like, you know, kind of that time of year, we're waiting. You mentioned, and you write in the poem, I failed you twice, this shriveled potato womb, this colonized brain, invasive with wrong ideas, misunderstandings, groping in the loam for what you planted. And I was just really interested in that, the wrong ideas and what was planted. And if it's something we haven't touched on that you'd like, if I could open up, you could let me know. It feels like something more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that poem in particular was more, that's I think in the third section where, you know, sort of I'm trying to bring together not just the personal family history, but also the lineage of being a white person who's also a Métis person, and sort of having a foot in both worlds, and the wrong ideas. I mean, my grandmother very much, she couldn't pass, but she really wanted to, and she was very proper in many ways. I mean, she ran away with a gigolo, but still, I mean, she was very proper in other ways. You know, she was always immaculately put together. When she passed away, we realized she was like tens of thousands of dollars in debt, with credit card debt from shopping at the Bay to buy nice slacks and things like jewelry and things. But you'd never know it just looking at her that she always looked like $1 million, and she behaved super proper. She spoke very proper. Her writing was beautiful, even though she only went to school until she was 14. Anyway, so so after she passed away, I was 21 when she passed, and by the time I was 22, I was in university and I was working for the Métis Archival Project. I was starting to get involved in Métis politics and Métis history and all sorts of stuff. And it was a very exciting time. This is in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was pre-Powley, for those of you who know anything about Métis stuff. The Powley era in 2003 just blew everything open and so much changed. And I was around for this very exciting time in Métis community politics and national politics and Supreme Court decisions and stuff like that. And I dedicated my whole career to it. And she would have been pissed off. She would have been like, "What are you doing? Go get a normal job." Oh yeah, no, she was, yeah, I mean, she left here and she would come back and visit her brothers. But she didn't, it's like she segregated her life and her family here from her life and her family in Edmonton, which was very much, very much wanting to be white, upper middle class, which they actually did achieve for a brief period of time until they got divorced and everything went to hell. But they actually were living in they were the first distributors of Old Dutch potato chips in Alberta, and which is a weird claim to fame, but they actually made a lot of money for about 10 years delivering potato chips and then sort of franchising. But yeah, she was very proper and she liked to be quiet and passing in the way that she didn't want people, because her family had, I mean, her brothers, one of them got run over by a train and my grandfather had to bring him home in like a box this big, and another one was homeless and went missing in Toronto, and I just found him about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. The Toronto Police Service actually was able to open a cold case on him and they found him, and he passed away in the late 70s. But for years, my grandma looked for him, and it was always this, like, her family was such a mess. Everybody was an alcoholic, and they were all over the place, and in and out of jail, and blah, blah, blah. And she really wanted to draw a hard line between that and the life that she had built in Alberta. And so me crossing that line and sort of being like, no, I'm gonna go back, and you've been moving here, right? Digging up all the skeletons, and yeah. So in a sense, like the wrong ideas being, it's not how she raised me. It's not how she raised me. But also on the flip side, the wrong ideas being, I can never fully be a Métis person because that's not how I was raised. So I have like super whiteness. I think like I'm so white. It's ridiculous. But and you know, and a lot of my Native friends and Métis friends and stuff, like it's funny, right? Like we make jokes about it, but in that sense, those wrong ideas as well, I think, are super important. I work with a lot of elders who would get very frustrated with me as they were trying to explain things, and my brain just wasn't getting it. And I had one elder I worked with for 7 years who very closely, and he would just get so frustrated with me because like he just could not get through. So those are also the wrong ideas, right? So sort of it's kind of a combination of that.
And did your grandmother's parents, did you ever know them?
No, my mom did.
Okay.
My mom did.
Okay.
Yeah, they died before I was born.
Okay.
Yeah, she was the second youngest of 14, so
Right.
her mom was like 89 when she died in 1970, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, they were born in the 1800s.
And I wonder what their relationship was to their culture, you know?
Well, they were in it 100%.
Okay.
Yeah, they were a very big Métis family.
And with your grandma, like,
yeah, I don't know if she cut it. She cut the tie. Yeah.
Gosh. Yeah. So you're kind of reconnecting.
I feel like I've reconnected, but yeah, when I was in my early 20s, I made a conscious effort to reconnect. Yeah. She couldn't stop me.
No.
She would have.
You have this great epigraph at the beginning, and I forgot to lead with it, but you ask, you're kind of hoping that, see if I can find it, To the ghosts of all her secrets, may they forgive my imagination. So I would love to open this conversation up to anyone who has questions, who's with us tonight. Because we can just keep talking, which we will later.
And we do have just a moment for questions, but if there are one or two from the audience, we can certainly take them. Stare ominously.
I got a
Okay, perfect. Question here and question there.
Guy in the blue shirt's not allowed to ask questions.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your collection. I wondered if you could just speak very briefly as to who your book is related to in terms of, what the influences are, your mother, like your writer influences, that kind of thing.
That's a good question. And hi, by the way. It's been like 20 years, I think, right? Yeah, I mean, so this was actually my MFA thesis when I was doing my MFA at UBC. So actually I wrote most of this book about 4 or 5 years ago. And in the later stages of my MFA, I really got into Natalie Diaz. I read everything she's written, and her use of color and imagery and stuff really resonated with me and spoke to me. I don't think that I've emulated that, but definitely she has influenced some of the ways in which I was trying to create images. Other than that, boy, it's a good question. Yeah, probably. I mean, I had Susan Musgrave as a teacher at UBC, and she, not just her writing, which I had actually read before she was my instructor, but also the way she instructed. Like she's kind of. Is this still being live streamed? It is. Okay. I don't think she's watching. In fact, I'm positive she's not watching. But she can take a bit of not a hard line, but she's just very forthright in how she talks about poetry and how she teaches poetry. So definitely she was a big influence. I had another instructor named Bronwyn Tate, who's younger but brilliant, just brilliant. And so definitely she really pushed us to explore and experiment and read beyond our comfort zones, and also to do creative imitations. So she would actually give us assignments saying, read this poet and then write a poem that emulates that poet. And so it really forced us to sort of try on different jackets and things like that. So we did a lot of Ross Gay and Juan Nguyen and oh boy, there's probably a dozen others that I'm blanking on right now, but I do know at the time that I was really deeply into polishing this collection up and getting it ready for my thesis. Natalie Diaz was definitely a big influence. I wish I could emulate her, but just being infused with make pictures. Right? That's sort of the motto that I was trying to follow. So.
And we do have time for one more question.
You can ask on Wednesday, Ian.
This is for all of us. Your Métis shines in your generosity, Erin. My question is, can you share with us something that your grandmother taught you?
Yes. Yeah. She taught me a lot of things. So picking one. My mom taught me how to cook, but my mom taught me how to cook with my grandma's recipes. And they were recipes that my grandma would make for me all the time. So chicken and dumplings, and baked bannock sandwiches, and Chinese or Japanese chicken wings. And she taught me the value of knowing where to order good Chinese food. Yeah. And hard work. She taught me about hard work. She used to, when I was I left home when I was 17, and I dropped out of high school and left home, and I was on my own. And I fluked out and got a job as a legal assistant with no education, no experience. I have no idea how it happened. And I was working full-time, and then at some point I decided I didn't want to work full-time anymore. So I told my bosses I don't want to work full-time anymore, I'll work half-time. Because I figured I could afford it, I could pay the rent with half my salary. And when I told my grandma, she got so mad at me. She was so mad. And you know, she kind of shamed me back into going full-time. I can't believe my bosses let me do it, but she shamed me into going back to full-time. And you know, really just the value of work hard. She scrubbed people's floors. She left high school, or she left junior high, I guess, at age 14, and went to work and worked her whole life. She was never not working. She was never, even when they made money, she worked. She did the books and handled the reception for Old Dutch Edmonton office and blah blah blah. So yeah, I think hard work probably would be the biggest lesson.
And you have a beautiful poem about that.
I do. Her and her comic cleaning powder.
Yes.
We'll sneak in this final question, and then following that, I'll turn things over to you for closing comments before I let people know how they can get books signed.
How has your relationship with your memories changed now that you were talking about how they were always there, like these ones that there's other ones that come up when you hear sounds and smells, but the ones that were kind of ever present. How has your relationship with those memories changed now that you've put it on paper and shared it with everybody and taken it out of this space for everyone else?
It hasn't. Yeah, it's funny, like the book itself, I was saying to my partner a month or so ago, it's like, why aren't you excited about your book coming out? And I was like, because it's done. Like I did it and it's out there and it doesn't belong to me anymore. Like I'm past it. But it's true, like, so in some ways, like the poems themselves, when I read them and I like focus on them and I force myself to like get into them, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember what this was. And but the memories themselves that prompted the poems, my relationship with them hasn't changed. Those are still intimately personal. They're still inside my brain. They're still inside my heart. They're sort of part of my physical makeup. So the memories haven't changed. The poems I'm far less attached to now than I was when I was doing my thesis and trying to get this book published. But yeah, it's funny actually. It's an interesting question. Yeah, the memories are still. It's like they're hardwired in us, I think, and they're always ours. You know, it doesn't matter what we do with them. Project them onto a big screen, and it still wouldn't be what's inside of us, I think. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for everything you've shared. I can't even believe that we spoke just like that, like for an hour, easy.
Oh my God, thank
Just
you.
so.
Thank you, Jennifer. You're
Oh.
such a gracious host and such a thought. I have to say, Jennifer and I went for coffee a couple of weeks ago, and what a careful reader. I felt like I was talking to Eleanor Wachtel.
I wanted to say, so in McGregor. One day, next time.
Fangirling a little. No, like you were such a careful reader, and you really come to reading it with a poet's eye, and you were picking out things that I hadn't thought of and hadn't recognized. And so thank you very much for all the attention. And thank you, McNally Robinson. Like this was amazing. You guys are so organized and sophisticated, and I really appreciate it. And I know my publisher does as well. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, John. And I'm excited because now we get to hold your book and read your book more. I believe John's going to come up and tell us how we can do that. Yeah, just thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we set you free.
And I'm going to continue being grateful, but before I do, I will go over some procedural notes. So in just a moment, we are going to pop into kind of like a poetic conga line and make our way over to a table that is just beside the cash desk. We will seat tonight's guest of honor behind the table, and then you can approach to get copies of the book signed. There are copies at the signing table. There are also copies at the cash desk. Feel free to get a copy signed before you pay for it. Please pay for the book. Other than that, we're so very grateful to Thistledown Press, to all of you for your attention, for your questions, and for being here this evening. The book is What Fills Your House Like Smoke. It is published by Thistledown Press, and I'd like to ask all of you to join me in one round of raucous applause for our wonderful host, Jennifer Still, and of course, E. McGregor.